You might have amazing people that the world's changed, the company's changed, and aren't the right fit, and it might be nothing to do with them. How do you avoid getting bloated? Because everyone who's well-meaning and wants to work, they will create work. So I usually come in like a wrecking ball and enforce pretty tough decisions. It's not elegant necessarily, but I think it's worked. I get a ton of resistance on that, especially to get bigger, and it's painful. It sucks. I'd like to think I'm a nice person, but being that table pounder of absolute only what we need. Like if you hired someone and you painted this big vision for them and the world changed and we don't need them anymore, make a tough call, be generous with severance, but you gotta push. So I know I get a lot of feedback now that I need to adapt as the company gets bigger, but I'm also really happy that I still sometimes get overly aggressive and force those things. So maybe the meta point is I think keep a little bit of founder energy, be comfortable that it might make people uncomfortable.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Super Insider. This time, Mark and I sat down with Chris Holes, who is the founder and CEO of Life360, which is the world's leading location sharing app for families. Chris started Life360 back in 2008, and he took the company public recently on the NASDAQ here in the US, 5 years later after the company's shares started trading publicly in the Australian Stock Exchange. Based on the recent public filings as of March 2024, Life360 had around 66 million monthly active users, and they're on track to generate $300 million of revenue for the year. I'm fortunate to have met Chris all the way back in 2014 when the company had around 30 employees, and I joined Life360 as roughly employee number 35 during the Series B stage. And if you want to learn more about that, go and check out episode 15 of the pod.
Yeah, Chris is a true inspiration. And we went deep on what key qualities does he look for in a product leader at different stages of the company growth, why he hates metric-driven product culture and his beef with the lean startup ideology, and why he decided to bring Gib Biddle, who is the former VP of product at Netflix, as a fractional CPO, and why he wouldn't do it again. We also talked about how he makes sure that his team continues to move fast as the company has significantly scaled, how he builds conviction and develops good taste as a product obsessed founder. And also, how does he keep his motivation intact after 17 long years of building? It was really an inspiring conversation for Ben and and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Thanks for listening.
All right, we have Chris Holes with us, the founder and CEO of Life360. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
You were my first founder CEO that I've worked for in my career, and I learned about product management at your company at Life360. So this is a real honor to have you on. And while I was only with Life360 for under 2 years, I just got a good sneak peek into a very special phase, I think, of the company's life. But you've gone on and done some really incredible things and recently celebrated a IPO in the US stock market. So congrats on that.
Thank you. And how
And
many people were at Life360 when you were there? I'm forgetting
I think I
now.
joined around like 35 people.
Is that small? Jeez.
I think I remember the Series C got announced, I think a week after
Okay,
I
yeah,
joined.
that probably was about that, maybe 50 or something. So
We
time
all fit
flies.
in
10
that
years ago.
one room in
Yep.
the old Twitter office in Soma.
Yep.
And by the way, that M3 story is still one of the most epic, like
True story.
startup stories I've heard in a long time.
Yeah. Chris taught me how to drive stick in China Basin on a Saturday, and then I spent a week with him and the team in Austin, and ended up joining the team after that. So it was a really cool experience. Very random way to get a job, but I think we felt a good fit culturally throughout that period. So,
For sure.
anyways, I've been a happy user of the product, by the way, this whole time too. So still very much using it all the time. Awesome. Well, Chris, I know we talked about a few different places we could start, but I really do think that as a product-minded founder, one of the things Mark and I really wanted to start asking you about is how you've gone about just thinking about that product leadership role at the various stages of growth for Life360, and really, if you can maybe tell us about the very first, time you had decided I really need to bring someone in to spend their full attention just on the product and start to delegate some of it.
I think if I share the history and what my suggestion or why we did things a certain way, I would be telling you how to do things wrong. So I'll answer your question a little bit more indirectly. I think a lot of it ties to like what kind of company you are. And at Life360, we are almost first and foremost a product company. I say almost because we have some pretty hard engineering. But I would suggest that founders for product oriented companies own that they're the spiritual leaders for a while. And I notice it almost every step of the journey when you bring people in. It's actually an extremely hard balance because you are going to get a lot of attention to let people have autonomy. People want metrics, and if a number goes up, they want that type of management. That's where the pressure goes. And I would be very careful about that. And I also be very careful, like, what type of product leader are you looking for? And I would bucket product leaders into three crude buckets. I'm talking on the fly here, so this is not necessarily well thought out. Be of the business product leaders, which are more around what is the strategy and all that. And you knew David Rice, Ben, he was a very much business oriented product leader. They're the more people and process oriented product leaders, like about getting the right people, setting up the right processes. And then I will call the product leaders. And they're the people who, like, when you talk about product, their first reflex is like how it looks, how it feels, that like little more Steve Jobs style, like it's an energy and a feeling and a more intuitive. So I did not realize that when someone has a product title, it could be any one of those or combo of those things. So I think at the earlier stages, the watch out I would have is like when you're sub 100 for sure. I think you maybe 50, definitely like find the product leaders, because I think a founder will struggle with someone that's doing something else because you'll be solving very different problems. So a lot of my challenges were bringing in more business people, and I think it should have been the product side. And that I had to navigate some of those challenges. So if you look at Gib, who was the former VP of product at Netflix, who was an interim product leader, I know we're going to be talking about him, but I would put him in the people and process side, but he was not in there actually thinking about what the product did at all, or even having opinions on, is this good, is this bad? It was really about how do you set up the systems and processes, which is not a bad thing whatsoever. It's just when and what type do you need. So that would probably be my single biggest advice to younger up and coming founders is like understand there are many flavors of product people and where you needing help.
What's a good question that you would maybe ask or advise a early stage founder that, let's say, maybe has product market fit? Because Mark and I feel pretty strongly bringing on a product leader or PM before you have product market fit is something we generally
Yep.
don't subscribe to. But let's say you have product market fit, you're starting to think about hiring that leader. What are some good questions you would maybe tell founders to ask themselves to make sure they find that right fit?
I would just ask them, what type of product leader are you and where do you focus the most? And it's open ended. There's no right and wrong. And if they start going right to metrics, that's one thing. If they talk about process, it's another. If they talk about just like the craftsmanship and really understanding and having like a sense of design, that would be more an indicator for me. They're more of the product ilk. And again, I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're all needed at different stages. I would be pretty ruthless on the companies and products they had built. Like if I'd seen someone that was at a company that's more like harvest mode, optimized versus a great user experience, I probably would be less open to taking a chance on someone like that for a company like ours, which is more user and design centric, which is extremely hard to do. And I would probably really push on like, how did you contribute in certain projects? Like, how did you set up the teams? How did you decide what success looked like? And I think a lot of times the air quotes right answer is about metrics and what the goals are and what number you move. Whereas I personally like people who start with craftsmanship. And that's probably a little controversial, but to me, it's helpful in terms of like just where are you naturally gravitating?
One of the challenges of working with a product leader is that a lot of times they also want to own that vision, right? They want to own that big picture. And the founders are usually pretty protective of that. So I'm curious, like, how have you find a good balance of what you delegate to them versus what they own, and making sure that you still
Yeah.
are the steward of that vision, if you will?
I still haven't solved that by any means. It's a perpetual issue and only gets worse as you get bigger because every time you double in size, you're probably 10x in complexity. So I don't know if anyone's ever figured it out, but we as founders should all be happy about this. Like if there weren't this like communication and process overhead, Google and Apple and Facebook should dominate the entire world. It's because this is messy that there's a chance for smaller companies to slot in. And I can see it firsthand. I get worried about being disrupted because we're not a giant company. We turn much more slowly than you'd think. But to your question, I actually don't think it's the product. People want more oversight of the vision. I think they're actually probably the least worried about that because it's really like if you're a product person, it's really about just making this thing that people would like really cool and like just the art of building a great product where I think the challenge you have with a more business oriented person is like that's actually company strategy. And so you're going to get a lot more push there. And then on the more people and process side, I don't think they'll fight you on it as much. But a lot of times you bring in more senior product execs, it's really about surfacing big ideas from other parts of the org, finding ways for people to functionally collaborate, finding ways to give team members the right level of control over decision making. And for obvious reasons, people usually want more, not less. So I have found if you find someone that's really all about the product, especially when I know we're slightly indexing to the earlier stages, that's in some ways the easier direction to go if you have spiritual mind share with someone. Like if I like pink and you like blue, then we're going to be colliding that way. But if you can find someone with similar sensibilities to you, yeah, that might actually be the easiest archetype to work with for a product oriented founder. But again, like really making sure do you like the same clothes and cars and food? I don't know, I'm making that up, but I think you would ideally find someone who's supplementary to you because you're similar arc versus complementary, which is like they're bringing something very different to the table.
Interesting. Do you feel like there have been any product leaders that you've brought on who have really made you feel like they're channeling your vision better than others? And without naming names, what are the types of activities that maybe a product leader does or the way that they show up that just makes you feel like stoked about what they're bringing to the table?
I have found it most impactful more those have gotten bigger, more the director level, because it is that sense of craftsmanship and just really understand what people like. A little less hard data, more a combo of intuition, talking to customers and the numbers. There is no right answer, right way to do things. And so I think when people kind of index like it's all about the numbers, is you only do what users say, and no one literally says that, but that energy, I think that's very problematic. And to the inverse of your question,
Hmm.
I think like data overuse is a horrible problem. I think the lean startup was one of the worst things for Silicon Valley. It used to be one of those things you were not allowed to speak against it because how could you be someone who doesn't like lean startup or agile? I think now there's at least a decent faction of us who say that was terrible, it was awful, it was misapplied, and I think most companies that started that approach were abject failures. I don't think it was actually bad concepts, and I think Eric Ries, who I've met a few times, I bet he would be even surprised how his beast has like morphed into this cult that is actually the antithesis of what they set up for.
And what's the biggest beef that you have with the lean startup or the things that you think that if you had applied them that would have maybe hurt?
Well, we would have just gone home because the data would have said there's nothing here. And the thing that people wanted in that was like crime data and like sex offender alerts. And if we pivoted it all there, we'd have been a dead company. And we had to have vision and belief that the world's going to come around to what we believe is going to happen. And we had some glimmers in the numbers that probably the time you were there, Ben, like I guess we had to run off a little bit before, but it was a little bit unclear like the size of the opportunity. But I think it's this endless pivoting and just chasing short-term metrics. Then you get teams doing these like mini bites that are just all over the place and they don't have a strong narrative arc. And I think it's terrible.
And it sounds then like at Life 360, the way the product teams make decisions is very centered around probably conversations that they've had with users or just a combination of that voice of the customer. I'm curious also, like as a founder, like how do you build conviction that the work that the team is showing you is actually on the right direction and is the right thing to work, given that as the company has grown, there's just so many levels between the PMs that are
Yeah.
probably doing the groundwork and you.
I haven't figured it out yet. One thing that we are doing is a lot more work in our strat planning process. I think at this scale we have to. And so we're trying to be a little bit more explicit, like this is the strategy. Everyone can contribute, but that is coming a little bit more tops down. We're trying to be very clear around what our values are. And if someone's like slaughtering the user experience at numbers, that will get you fired, not promoted. Another one is strong North stars. So let's build out what we think this thing's going to look like in a year or two. And then, yeah, we'll learn as we go, but we know the mountain we're climbing and we even have pretty high fidelity mock-ups and wireframes and all that, because then I can say we are building to this. Let's learn along the way. But I think going back to my rant on agile or lean startup, it's like it's taken way too literally. Or people just testing these little baby steps and throw crap into the market and then it doesn't work. Like, oh, no one wants this. Well, that is complete BS. One of my biggest pet peeves is we have like so Life360, we like many startups have bitten off, not we're a startup anymore, but we continually bite off more than we can chew. And so if you launch a half baked product, either for whatever reason it got half baked and you If you go to a team like, oh, we want to survey our users and see, is this the feature, do people value this? Well, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you have a feature that sucks, it's buried, that no one uses, of course, if you survey, people aren't going to like it. And like, well, hey, wait a second, where's the narrative arc behind that? Like, we might have plenty of features that are bad ideas, but if you just start with do the survey, look at the numbers, I think you're a dead company.
No, it's true. I mean, as a user of Life360, I joined the company in 2014, left late 2015. And I think the core value proposition of the product has stayed focused for me
Yep.
as a user since that time. And yet, when I look at some of the publicly traded filings, I see that the numbers of users have dramatically been increasing. So it's not like you have to move away from the core value proposition to get the numbers to move in the right direction. If anything, it seems like the company's been hard at work at just making the main thing better. And then after I left Ubidoff, I think some of the driver analytics and
Yep.
some
Yeah, that's
more of
done very
like
well.
the peace of mind offerings for families who have had Life 360 in their family for years now, right? So it's like you figured out a way to stay with those families as they mature without compromising the
Yep.
core value proposition.
And I wish we could move faster because we want to cover all life stages. And man, it's so hard to broaden out a product. I really understand why big companies do what they do now. Because again, we're not big, but I just am in awe that any company of thousands of people can get anything done because it's so hard.
And speaking of moving faster, especially with the current economy, a lot of companies are pushing for leaner teams, faster teams.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you've tried internally that you've seen interesting results and that you're going to double down on? Or
There's tension point that comes up almost every single year is as we get bigger, we're not going bankrupt, we generate cash. It's very hard to make people force tough decisions. And you might have amazing people that the world's changed, the company's changed, aren't the right fit. And it might be nothing to do with them. How do you avoid getting bloated? Because everyone who's well-meaning and wants to work, they will create work. So I usually come in like a wrecking ball and enforce pretty tough decisions. It's not elegant necessarily, but I think it's worked. I get a ton of resistance on that, especially as you get bigger and it's painful. It sucks. I'd like to think I'm a nice person, but being that table pounder of absolute only what we need, like if you hired someone and you painted this big vision for them and the world changed and we don't need them anymore, make a tough call, be generous with severance, but you gotta push. So I know I get a lot of feedback now that I need to adapt as the company gets bigger, but I'm also really happy that I still sometimes get overly aggressive and force those things. So maybe the meta point is I think keep a little bit of founder energy, be comfortable that it might make people uncomfortable, realize that as you get bigger, you're going to get all these execs telling you that you need to change. And I hear this from so many other founders who have gone further than me. Like you got to adapt, you have to grow, but just I think a lot of the reason that founder-led companies do better is you have that disruptive force that stays with the company that almost by definition, you'll not be able to make it super calm and mature and process-oriented. Some of it is the chaos of it.
Chris, I think it's really clear for anyone that's been using the product and has worked with you that you're opinionated and you have a clear vision of the kind of experience and company that you're trying to work towards. And I'm just
Yep.
curious, you don't have any like formal training, quote unquote, as like a product manager. So could you share a little bit more about how have you managed to become so opinionated and I think right in a lot of ways as a product leader and a product visionary, in addition to
Um,
doing all the other business stuff that you have to do as a founder?
I've always had ideas and tinkered and built things. This is a stereotype about VCs, but it's like if you heard there's always certain, often wrong. So I am always certain and often wrong. I'm making fun of myself there because I'm often wrong, but I think this I share that as a really innate quality where if I see something, I'll talk out of my you know what way too often, but I'm aggressive and I believe it, and I'd like to think I'm smart enough to have my confidence shaken and change my mind regularly. But I think it does start with I'm a creative, curious person. I love building stuff. I'm probably overly assertive. I have strong beliefs. And I think that just ties directly with product and product management as a function when we got going was very different anyway. And so I think a lot of these things are more organic. And I bet a lot of the companies in the 90s probably didn't even have product managers and it was just people like building stuff or were good at it.
Do you think that the field of product management is going anywhere just as someone, because ultimately it's only valuable to the degree that it serves the company and that it's valued by company leaderships as a function, right? So I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on where it's heading?
I think you in many ways to skin the cat and there's no right answer. And Like Microsoft used to call product managers program managers. So some of it's just a game of semantics. So I think it would depend on what is the company, what's the thing you're trying to solve? Because someone's always, I think, playing that function. It might come from other areas, but I would think like with product management, you're shepherding the overall direction of the product that's being delivered to customers, and it's understanding that intersection of design and engineering and user research and strategy and vision and business. And the PM is the function that ties that all together. I think it's an important one.
You said you have strong beliefs. You probably have a good perception of what good taste is or what good design is. I'm curious, how do you develop your own beliefs and taste for what a good product is?
Just use stuff and feel it. I try to really understand when I look at things that have worked, like what is it that made them work and why? Like Airbnb is probably the prototypical of like design focused, each step of the user experience delightful. Not all companies need to do that by any means, but that's more what I would like. I feel we failed in some regards. We're like a B plus, but I want to be an A plus in terms of our user experience. So we're a little bit dry and utilitarian. It's been so hard for me. That goes back to people, and it's really hard to design and a craftsmanship oriented product. It's extremely hard. Forces to fight you on it daily.
I think you've done a good job, though. I don't want you to berate yourself too hard. Like when I open the app now and I see that, for example, if my wife is walking home from the grocery store, I see a indicator in the app that she's
Yeah.
walking, and it looks different if she's driving, and it like
Not good enough. It's always not good enough. And maybe that's the innate thing in there. Like people tell me I will immediately go to what's not working, and I need to get better at motivating people and be able more raw, but I will find something wrong with anything in milliseconds. And that I think is an innate quality.
one of the
I
cool things about this product too, in that sense, is that you could use it. You are a power user of the product in a way that maybe other company CEOs have a harder time being power users of. But I remember you always using it and just presenting things that weren't working well for you. Have you continued to constantly share what you're
and
thinking
I,
about your
and that was
personal
never
experience? Yeah.
well, now I am almost in the segment, but I didn't have kids and I was a single guy when I started it, and we were a mom product. So I just would just make sure I
You were
used
using
it.
it with friends, if I'm not wrong. I think you were trying to to dog food the product with, like, friends and maybe even
Yeah.
your parents that were visiting or something like that?
Yeah. I'd use it with everybody and just lean into it. But I am OCD. I don't know if that's another quality. I've never, not like clinically diagnosed, but I probably could get a OCD diagnosis if I wanted, just because if I see something that bothers me, I'm going to obsess over it. And so I would obsess over the product.
Hmm.
By the way, I think that's like another reason why founder-led companies do a little bit better too, right? I think probably 9 out of 10 founders that you talk to have a similar feeling of like, this is good, but there's 1,000 ways it could be better.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it's an uncommon quality at all.
I think there's a danger in delegating that too. Like, I think that there's some founders that kind of seem to first of all, I think they enjoy it less than you do, Chris. Like, I think deep down, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but is the product side one of your more favorite parts
Yeah,
of being a
it's
founder?
more the creation side. I mean, I don't have fun bug testing and things like that, but understand like thinking through where the world's going and having a strategy and building stuff. Yeah, 100%.
One of the things we want to talk to you all about also is just like fractional product leadership.
Yeah.
We don't have to spend too much time on it, but I know that you brought Gib, as we talked about earlier, into Life 360. I think it was either late 2014 or early 2015 at some point.
Yep.
And I would just love to understand maybe like the thought process that led to bring in someone with Gib's deep, long
Yeah.
experience into the fold at that Series B. I think it was at a Series C at that stage already.
Something in that zone.
And then if you talk to other founders and other people today, like how do you maybe talk to them if they're thinking about bringing someone a few days a week into the fold versus
Sure.
insisting on full-time people
So
5 days
backing
a
up
week?
for context,
Yeah.
I think the name Gib means known to most people, although some people might actually know him from the product community. So we were growing, looking for a CPO. We came across this guy, Gib Biddle. His resume was like freaking 10 out of 10, like reported to Reed Hastings at Netflix and the CPO at Chegg and just so many amazing companies. He was at the phase of life where he did not want a full-time job, but when I talked to him, I would just learn so much from him. I was like, I got to get this guy on board. And we're led to was like, what if he can come in 3 days a week? He loves skiing. And so I would more pair up with him. He'd be an interim product leader while we continued the search. So that was the story. I learned so much from Gib, but I would not do that again. I think the advice of not having a fractional product leader is good advice. we all worked out in the end, and I think net Gib was great, but I think I could have gotten a lot more from Gib if he were more explicitly like a highly engaged advisor, because there was the expectation that he was running the team and managing the team. And he didn't have the same kind of in the trenches investment in it. And in hindsight, he was much more the people and process side of things. And I think there was a phase shift there. When you were 50 people, which I think is probably what we were when Gib joined, it is much more the product side. And so what I learned from Gib is like, how do you set up different teams that are highly aligned but only very loosely coupled? How do you run A/B tests? How do you systematize metrics? How do you report on them and align the company around that? All extremely important things, but I think what we really needed at the time would have been much more product person who could have been supplementary to me versus complementary, because the skills I had were completely orthogonal to Gibbs. I'm so happy he was there because I learned so much from him, but we needed another one of me at that point in time just as much, if not more, as someone who could help set up that system and process. So I think we could probably get out that system and process piece with someone like Gibbons Advisory. He was an amazing board member. He wasn't on the board, but that would have been, I would have tried to recruit him for that. But I think in general, fractional anything for key roles is very dangerous. And so I would ascribe to the standard wisdom there. And that was standard wisdom at the time too, but I just thought Gib was so impressive that it would be worth it to make an exception, because there are times to make exceptions. But as I mentioned, I think we should have brought him on. I think it was correct that this is someone I could learn from and it would be amazing. He shouldn't have been running the whole team, because I think it did set up.
So at the time, there were how many PM? If I'm not mistaken, maybe 3 PMs or so, like
I think it's
ICs,
a little bit more. I'm trying to think through
3 or
my
4.
fingers, but maybe I was thinking 5. But in any case, in that zone, this is a decade ago, so I barely remember. You might be right.
In hindsight, what's like the right level of seniority that you would have probably looked for that kind of like most senior product hire under you?
I would have looked for someone who in the last decade had been at a company of our stage and had seen the next corner to look around. And I still ascribe to that. You want someone who knows the exact challenge you've had, and ideally they've progressed beyond you. So not like last year, but the last 5, 10 years. And then they've seen the next corner versus like 3 corners or 3 steps ahead. Because companies have to add so much scaffolding and process and systems as they get bigger. And so it's extremely hard to get that dial right. So much of my job feels like I bring in the startup guy. They're acting much like a startup. I got to push them up to value the processes and understand the tax you have to pay with scale, or the people that have not been operating at our level in a very long time and say, this is a corner you actually can cut, or it's actually okay to be a little bit more tops down here and be unapologetic about it. And so that load balancing is tough.
I think it's such a good point of hiring people that have seen that stage, have seen maybe the next stage. And I think there's definitely been examples of product leaders that have been able to grow with the company as the company has scaled very quickly. I'm curious if there has been any examples of that you've worked with, and maybe what made those product leaders so special that allowed them to adapt, even though they maybe hadn't seen that next level.
A lot don't, but I think it's realizing the need to, very generic statement, but the job today in a company that's growing is going to be completely different tomorrow. So people that have that versatility, people who realize it's not just a nice, simple process to get ahead in the world and in life. I think just raw intelligence does matter quite a bit. Raw intelligence is not a prerequisite for success in a lot of ways. You can get pretty far by systems, processes, being disciplined, being a good people person. But I don't have a lot of those skills. I'm so on the people front. I have extremely bad ADHD. I can't run a process for the life of me. I'm always late on bills, and as a kid, could never get my homework done. So all different types are needed, but I do think people who just are that intellectual curiosity, high intelligence do the best, is adapting to different scales.
And I'm also curious, the company has also grown a lot in the last 17 years. So you've gone from the inception to now a publicly traded company in a couple of markets. How do you continue to learn and evolve as a person? Like, what has been the most helpful thing that you do to
Hiring
adapt?
the people that you have around you, also cliche, but very true. I read a lot, and blog posts and books are helpful, but I think it's the people around you where you can read anything, but actually experiencing it is different. So board members, team members, my own general desire to learn, don't have anything more specific beyond that. And when things go well, learn from them. When things go poorly, learn from them.
Chris, what's one thing that's I haven't thought about before this conversation, but I'm noticing is given your self-prescribed ADHD, and I know I've seen some instances during the short time that we work together that you get excited about a new idea. And as a founder, why wouldn't you? There's always new growth
Yeah.
areas, new opportunities. How do you manage the shiny objects in the background, and how do you continue to give your best to like the core, even though there's probably always things coming up on the periphery that excite you?
I'm much better at that now. I still have not solved it, but I think very few number of goals, making sure you finish what you start, being very clear with the team. Let's get something to A before we move on to the next thing and pick it up. And maybe it's tough because you have all this pressure to do things. I'm definitely not a shining star here at all. So I don't think people should be looking at me as a exemplar, but I can say it's really hard. One piece of advice I would give, this is very tactical and not directly related to the shiny object per se, but I think one piece of dangerous advice is if you're planning, take however long you think it will be and double it. Because I think people do that. They take that very literally. Oh, look, I doubled my estimate. All good. I think it's actually no. If you think your company is going to be successful and grow and scale, take however long you think it's going to be and increase it by 30 times. And that
Mm.
might sound like a crazy thing, but I actually mean it. I was probably that level of being off in terms of my estimates, in terms of how long things would take, because it gets harder and harder and harder as you get bigger, because you have more surface area, you have tech debt, you have more people, you have communications overhead, you have regulatory, you have legal, you have back-end systems. I mean, Ben, you were at Facebook. I imagine that was probably insane there, all the stuff you had to get through. I've never been at a company of more than 500 people or 600 or wherever we are now. I do not, it's so hard to get something through a established big system. And I'm actually curious, Ben, maybe you've seen now that you've been through some of these mega orgs. Does that resonate?
Yeah, well, what happens at Facebook scale where you have like 2,000 product managers and 50 or 60,000 total employees is it's actually near impossible to go talk to users as a PM. So you have to rely on a lot of other people to go and talk to the users. It's very data driven because any single anecdote kind of doesn't carry weight internally. And then you spend most of your time coordinating and trying to do I mean, it's like all of your quote unquote battles are not against your competition at that point. It's all internal and coordination and competition, and everyone's trying to get the best performance review. So everyone's trying to game the performance review system. Like it becomes a lot more about those kind of things than
How
it
do you game
does.
the performance review system at Facebook?
You just understand what people value and then you just do those things and you let everything else drop. So, as a PM, for example, at Facebook, if you want to get promoted, one of the most visible things that you could do is drive a strategic alignment that drives some kind of reorg internally, right? You're probably like, that sucks. Like, if you get to a point where people get rewarded for that kind of thing, but at their scale, they actually do need a lot of this stuff to get ironed out at the ground level because you can no longer expect the leadership to understand the trade-offs at the ground level, at that level of fidelity. But I'm an early stage guy. Like I learned a lot at the Facebook scale, but I personally like the stuff we're talking about here with craft and product resonates a lot more with what I enjoy and what gives me energy and like creating that delightful user experience. Let's see. So, Mark, anything you want to cover before we maybe move to some kind of like closing questions?
In preparation for this call, I noticed that you were in another podcast recently and you mentioned that you're thinking of expanding into the senior
Yep.
care market. So how do you decide that now is the right time to expand to an additional persona, if you will?
So we have a longer narrative arc, which is how do we cover family life at all life stages. The free users really are already there from cradle to grave. We have this amazing retention. Our cohorts are dead flat and actually tick up a little bit. So we're an outlier in that regard, but we do get some churn on the paid side when kids go to college and that visceral anxiety around driving goes away. And we obviously have Apple breathing down our necks. And so how do we differentiate? And there's these, in our minds, these very pointed services for the specific life stage. So in terms of when, there's no firm answer here. Going back to an earlier question, we have done most things too early and then they've done them half baked. So I want to make sure we're good enough to move on to the next thing. Then we do it versus opening up a new front too soon. I don't have a hard metric there, but I would say if you have a bunch of like mediocre quality stuff in your product, which ideally wouldn't have been there to begin with, you probably are not ready to open up a new front. And going back to that estimation thing. Things don't take twice as long as you think. They're like 30 times longer than you think. And it gets harder and harder as you get bigger. So no answer, but I just say be very careful.
When you think about this kind of expansion play, Chris, do you think the right way to think about it really is like 0 to 1 product? Like it's a brand new product offering, or do you really think of it more as an expansion play?
For us, it's an expansion, but the idea is we already have the user locked in and engaged, staying through life stages. And our upsells work great when they're contextually relevant, but just saying, hey, get a senior care thing, like we don't really have nearly as much advantage as people would think. And if you're at Facebook, I think one thing people, I imagine this, again, making this up, no one's told me this, but I imagine sometimes people like, oh, like these giant companies have all these users, like you just launch anything, you point your customers to it. It's actually really hard. You can do that one or two times, but you don't just get to say, oh, this new thing exists, please use it. I bet Facebook has thousands of things that it built. Like, be like, Facebook built that?
Well, let's just say for every one thing that they launch that they do send everyone to, there's probably another 100 or 200 that a bunch of the PMs running those products wanted that traffic. And ultimately, someone at the executive level said, no, we're not
Yeah.
going to use this like really visible surface to send traffic to you.
Yeah, it's hard.
I
And
worked
that's
in one
why
of
I also
those.
think
Yeah.
when people are like, oh man, Google's going to go in your space and kill you or whoever, I could imagine a world, I've never worked at Google, where you almost disadvantage to be working within those big companies, even with all their resources, unless you're one of the anointed two or three things that they say at the top is going to happen and you get the full weight of the battleship. And so I can see the little version of that. And so the reason I'm just making that assumption, which sounds to be accurate, is that you can only, no matter how big you are, put your resource in a very limited number of things.
Yeah. We saw this with Threads, right? With Instagram, where that could not have been a more visible direction of traffic from Instagram to a brand new app. And that doesn't happen without Zuck being 100% on board, right? There's no way.
Yep.
Um,
How's Threads doing?
I mean, obviously don't have any proprietary info, but at last I saw a public article about it. It looked like they were stabilizing at, I think, over 100 million monthly active users. And I think it seems very healthy now that the initial buzz died down.
Could mean a lot of things, though. They throw it up in your feed and that's actually maybe tied to the dangers of metrics. What does 100
Hmm.
million active users mean when it's built into Facebook?
I don't use
Yeah.
it, but then again, I've stopped using X too. So I don't know if I'm even in the target
Completely.
audience for
Why'd you
that
stop?
product.
Getting addicted?
No, I think the experience just started sucking, and I think I found that I've enjoyed the dialogue and conversation on LinkedIn a lot better. So I feel like
Mm,
LinkedIn has a higher ROI for like enjoyment for me, and also from a business perspective, I find that it's generating more meaningful conversations.
interesting.
Yeah. The interesting thing about it, Threads too, is you see that data, but I don't know anyone in my circle that uses Threads on a recurring basis of has replaced X with it.
Same.
But yeah, I'm with you, Ben, about LinkedIn. The one thing that I'll say is that LinkedIn is really bad at servicing political content or just like breaking news content that you just want to get a sense of what people are thinking. And I feel like X has been really nice
Yeah,
about that
that's more
for
news than
that.
politics.
Exactly.
Chris, well, on the topic of expanding or launching new products, however someone wants to think about that, one thing I've noticed is I've worked on a couple different brand new product teams within companies. And I've talked to people that do this kind of 0 to 1 product work also in other companies where like they come into a company that has an established thing and then there's like a desire to grow the TAM, expand the market. So there's the need to incubate new ideas. And one thing that I hear is that companies are pretty bad at evaluating and measuring and funding the new bets differently than they think about measuring and evaluating and funding their existing kind of like table stakes investments. And I'm just curious if you've learned anything over the years about how to create the right kind of environment where brand new investments can thrive and not necessarily have to look like failures all the time because they're not moving the needle as much as the core stuff.
I don't have a great answer for you, but I think the companies to do lots of things well. Optimization's important, innovation's important, one or two big bets is important. If you only do one thing, you'll probably in the end get yourself in trouble. The obvious one is optimizing to the local maximum, which is I can keep ranting on how much I hate the lean startup. That was probably the I think most companies fall into that one, but you could also go from like new thing to new thing and never integrate them all together, and then they all suck and are not cohesive, and then the data says they're not doing well, and then you shut them down. So how we've thought about it, our size, if we can do a really new thing every 1.5, 2 years, that's probably the realistic cadence in terms of big new things. The younger founder me like, are you kidding me? That's so slow. That's so miserable. I think that's just a law of nature. And going back to Facebook and Threads and all that, when I think about what Facebook's done and what are their big things over the last decade, bought stuff, but Instagram was 2012. WhatsApp was not that long after. So they're two biggest things they bought.
Oculus,
Threads is big. Which one, sorry?
Oculus, like the
Oh,
VR
yeah,
set.
okay, Oculus.
Yeah,
Yeah, all the VR stuff. I think Marketplace is probably turning into a bit of a stealth hit, but it's really not very many things. And this is a
yeah,
company with $1 trillion, whatever, hundreds of billions dollar market cap with all the resources and very few big new things coming out. And Oculus, whether it succeeds or fails, I'm very impressed with that. Like it really brought the world forward. But yeah, how many of those initiatives did they do? And that was actually purchased as well. So
exactly.
how many? Yeah, yeah. And how many? What have been the homegrown Facebook hits?
Maybe Messenger.
Yeah, Messenger works.
Messenger, I'd say Marketplace, though, does
Yeah,
stick out to me in a category of its own, for sure.
but I say that, and then look, there's a huge company that's like over a decade. You can think of just it's been mainly optimizations around the core, other than things they bought.
Yeah. And sometimes I wonder how much does it have to do with the fact that they're a public company and they have to report on a quarterly basis. And maybe
I
like a
don't
question. Yeah.
I don't think so for Facebook because you did all the Meta stuff and Oculus and all that, and then it finally succumbed to the market when they beat the crap out of him. But he controlled the board and everything, so I don't think so.
Chris, do you feel like being a publicly traded company has changed any of the way that you approach new product
Yeah,
development or just, yeah?
yes, and so there are downsides of being public. We've been public for 5 years now. We more recently moved to the U.S., but it honestly feels identical. When I tell people that, I think there's the best thing about being public, which is not good for my mental health, is like you have constant pressure. Because I think companies get further along, they get stable, not going bankrupt. It's very easy to get soft. And if you're public, every quarter the goalposts are moved. So there's almost no world in which life doesn't get harder. Because if things are going poorly, you get the crap beaten out of you, and that sucks. And you have to scramble and solve that. If you have a really good quarter, then you have to put your guidance up. And now you're stressed out because your expectations just jumped up. So you are on this machine of like intense pressure cooker that is painful, but it's this external forcing function. I think the downside or the upside is it narrows the range of outcomes. So when you're public, I think Google and Facebook are different because of the outlier of outliers. But if you're a second tier public company like us, and I'm happy to say we're second tier because like maybe one day we'll be Google, but we're not right now. Being public stops really bad things from happening because it's very hard to go and bet the farm on something crazy. So it limits the downside, but also limits the upside. So I think being public kind of cuts back your range of outcomes to some degree. Obviously, many exceptions around that, but I would imagine you're going to see way more catastrophic failures and like mega wins for companies of our valuation in the private markets.
It's pretty inspiring hearing you say this. And it sounds like it's been like 17 years of a journey. You've probably had a nice windfall from going public and experiencing all this pressure.
Yeah.
You've already made it, but you're clearly committed to keep going and keep building. And I'm curious, what is motivating you to continue to build a company?
So a number of things. And yeah, I've had a windfall that puts me in a very nice place, but probably not as much as people think. 'Cause most of my net worth still is in the company, maybe 80% or something like that. We just raised more money. And even though these big funds that are like nameless to most people, like they're real people. And we gave this story about why we're going to make them a bunch of money. And yeah, they know it's risky and things go up and down, but I can't take someone's money and then just disappear on them. So probably a sense of doing right by the people that backed us is number one. Number two is I feel like we could be so much bigger and the job isn't done. And fell into this whole category. So it's not actually passionate about the category, but it's like, I can just see how big it could be. And then there's probably the third is a financial element where, yeah, I'm in a very privileged and fortunate spot, but still the vast majority of my dollars are in the company and realize that.
Is there any other job that you like if you just found the perfect person to take over Life 360 and you thought that the shareholders would be better off, the customer, it's just a completely imaginary scenario, but if you found someone who's just way better than you to run the company, is there
Yeah.
any other job you've ever thought about having or something else you thought about
I have
doing?
all sorts of ideas. I do like building things. I want to build a really weird house. I want to do some of that with my own bare hands. I have lots of strange philosophical and political ideas. I want to explore some of them. So I would have plenty of things to keep me busy. I want to build a really fancy new chicken coop at my place too, which is a random one. I got an idea. That's just to tell you the crap that comes in my mind. So
If you have any sketches,
product,
you should totally publish those.
I have big ideas, maybe actually some relation to stuff. I can see good design instantly. I have no skills myself. So I
So
know that
if
about me.
someone's listening and they want to design your futuristic
Actually,
chicken coop,
seriously, I need
yeah.
someone to do good CAD and it's all figured out in my head with the big blocks. But yeah, it's actually, it gets me excited like the startup days again. It's like, it's going to be a combo of like chickens and quails and guinea fowl and ducks, and it's going to be pretty sweet. So I need someone to build it for me.
All right. So usually we ask every guest as we close, one, where can people learn more about you? And two, how can they be helpful? So I think we already checked the second one is if they want to design your chicken
They
coop
can get, please.
setup, that's
There you
one way to be
go.
helpful. But
If
what
you
else
can,
would
if
you
you,
say?
to me, we're always looking for good people. There's nothing I really need right now. And then to your question, learning more about me. I'm not intentionally an outbound person, so there's not much out there. You can see our interviews, you can see our stuff, but I'm not a big poster on social media or anything. So
We'll link to the career page at
there
Life360
you
in the
go.
episode notes so people can go take a look. And then obviously, if someone sees something interesting and you want to chat with me more, and I think it could be a good fit, I'm happy to chat with you and maybe
Great.
send Chris your info and see if he's interested in chatting. Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate your time. We know you're really busy, but this was a great conversation. It's great catching up. And thanks
Thank
again
you.
for teaching me how to drive stick. That's
Yeah, it was
it's been helpful.
fun to see you after all these years.
Sounds
Thanks
good.
so much, Chris.
All right. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with someone who you think would benefit from it as well. We really appreciate it. We'd also love a follow or a rating on Substack, Spotify, or YouTube. That's going to let other people find us. And if you have any topic recommendations for a future episode, please send myself or Mark a DM on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.